talk about the Ari as a person, but more about his kind of mystical understanding. One of the things that the Ari has been credited with is the kind of this idea of the Zimzum that we're going to talk a little bit about today. The Zimzum, although now there's some kind of academics that are questioning whether they're actually finding earlier antecedents, some lesser known Kabbalists who talk about their version of the Zimzum. But by and large, nobody really heard about this concept of the Zimzum, this idea of the divine contraction before the Ari. So I'm going to be reading from a text. This is a translation of Otros Chaim. The Otros Chaim is a version of Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, which is considered the magnum opus of Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the main disciple and scribe of the Ari. The Otros Chaim is one of the versions of Eitz Chaim that has a majority of Eitz Chaim contained within it. So, and it's actually written by Rabbi Chaim Vital. So this is the beginning. You know what? I wish, could somebody do me a big favor? There's a Zabar's bag. Yeah. Behind a plastic bag. If you could grab it, it's behind the main podium on the table. I have the actual Otros Chaim there. So I'm going to read it in English. An introduction, the Gate of Circles. Igulim. And the teachings on Adam Kadmon. We'll get to that. An introduction that encompasses from the one without end, sorry about the misspellings, until Zer Ampin, the divine emotions. Okay, I'm not even gonna. It says advanced, so I'm sorry. I'm not gonna stop to explain that. Know that in the beginning of all existence there was a simple undefined light that's called Ein Sof. Without end. Sorry again. Don't focus on the spelling here. You can focus on it for a minute. It's terrible, I know. And there was no hollow or empty space, but rather everything was light of the one without end. When it arose in his simple will to emanate that which emanated because of the reason that is known, which is so that he could be called compassionate one and gracious one, and similar names. Because if there was no one in the world that could receive his compassion, how can he be called compassionate one? And similarly, this idea would apply to the other kinuyim. Kinuyim are other secondary names of God, like Chanun is compassionate, Rachum, merciful, etc. Then he contracted or withdrew himself from the center of his light, right? The famous Zimzum, in the point of the core that was in his center. In other words, the contraction took place from wherever the inner core of that is. Later Kabbalists talk about what is the core of the Or Ein Sof. What is the center of the Or Ein Sof? Where did the actual concealment take place primarily? Was it the mind of God or the heart of God or the Malchut, so to speak, the lowest level of the Or Ein Sof Shlifnei Zimzum that this kind of concealment took place in? And there he contracted, concealed himself to the sides, and that which surrounded, meaning the sides and the surroundings is the same idea. This idea of kind of if we were to use a little drawing, again, all of these things, and I just was privileged to be studying with Danny Matt at one of Danny's lectures in New York, and you had the text from Rav Moshe Cordovera that said, don't think of any of these conceptions of Adam Kadmon in any physical form. They're all parables. So I really believe that the Ari thought the same thing. He didn't literally think that God is in a circle or a square or in a line, but rather they're kind of abstract concepts. It's not idolatry. So you have this.
Might be computerized.
You're probably right. You're right. I am not smartboard literate. And I need the password. Even if I was, I don't have the password. So.
Now it's really conceptual.
Yeah. Okay, so here you have the circle. But this is advanced, so you're already. In the beginning when I started studying the Ari, I was like always having to picture it with like, I got to get this in my mind. I have to see how this would look. I'm like, stop it already. It's an idea that if you think you have to see how it would look, you don't get it. And that's when you start understanding what it is. It's a concept. So let's keep reading a little bit here. And I'm going to give you some ideas of what that idea might mean. Not what it does mean. Because as soon as you know what it means, it isn't what it is anymore. And there was an empty space in the middle. I'm on 3 lines from the bottom of this, the top of the text. And this was the first contraction of the elevated emanator. I don't know how to spell emanator, but that's not the way to do it, right? The source of all sources, the Meitzel, he's called in Kabbalistic terminology. And this place of the emptiness is circular in equal proportions on all sides, until the world of Atzilut and all the worlds are within this empty space. Wondering if I translated that right. We'll take a look at it in a moment. The light of this infinite one surrounds it equally on all sides. And behold, next page, to save paper, it's on the other side of the page. When he contracted himself, then from one side of the empty circular space, he drew his light through a measured, straight, thin line, similar to a pipe, wire, whatever. In other words, if there was this kind of circular space, I'm using the smartboard, right? And God's original light is surrounding on the sidelines of this kind of theater, this round amphitheater, but there's a ray of light that comes down from one end, not from both ends, but one end that comes down into this vacuum, into this kind of empty space. Light is drawn from the Ein Sof without end into this emptiness and fills it. Again, when it says fills it, it doesn't mean it literally fills it. It means it begins the process of building something within this idea of a place where God's original light is concealed. However, there remains an empty space between the light that is in the Halal and the light of the infinite one that surrounds it. In other words, he just means to say that the light doesn't go all the way through from one end to the other. It's not coming up and down. It's just going down from the top and not reaching the bottom. If it reached the bottom, kaput, all that work would be for nothing. The Ein Sof would then just reflood that emptiness, which he'll say that. As we mentioned, that is now on the sides. The line goes down towards the bottom of the void, but not touching the light of the infinite one on the other side. Okay, now he's just saying what I just said. So, for if they did, the matter existence would revert to how the matter here doesn't mean matter. It means the idea that this, whatever was, would revert to how it had been prior to the contraction. In other words, this new concept of the Zimzum would go out of business. It would go back to the Ein Sof Shel Lifnei Zimzum, to the infinite light before the contraction. The light in the void would reconnect to the light surrounding the void as it had been originally in the entirety of the Chalal, and then it would just kind of reflood it. And for this reason, the light didn't come into the void in its full width, but only like one thin line, as was mentioned. That's also why there's a line. A line means a very limited amount of light that came in, a measured amount. If it would have been a big chunk of light coming in, also could have put out this kind of early idea of this defined space outside of God's infinite revelation of light.
Is this having to do with maybe I'm on the wrong track here, matter and antimatter?
No.
No.
No, this has nothing to do with science. Actually, you can read, Danny Matt has a book on this, about Kabbalah and the Big Bang. There's actually a lot of scientists love this stuff.
Yeah, I've been studying with a scientist.
Yeah, but I'm like, I think it's wonderful. I mean, there's a book by an astrophysicist from Santa Cruz that writes about, like re-understanding a spiritual concept of the universe based on modern science, and he quotes a big chunk of this, saying it's not so off. Like, of all of the kind of world's religions and philosophies, this is like pretty good with the Big Bang. I don't know, maybe this is a question for you in terms of science and Kabbalah. I'm not a big fan of overly reading science into Kabbalah, simply because, you know why there are good Jewish doctors? Because, except in LA, where all the rabbis are healers, for much of history, the rabbis let the doctors be the healers, and they were the rabbis. There's a book by Sharon Neufeld, I believe it is, on Maimonides, and in the introduction, that's her, I don't know if it's her theory, but she talks about that by Judaism not insisting that they understood healing, and they allowed the scientists of the day, including Jewish doctors, to practice their healing, that grew the profession, rather than controlling it from the rabbinic literature, so to speak. And I would say the same thing for science in general. I don't want to too closely link up religion and science. I know it sounds bad. But on the other hand,
Is that an artificial rift? I mean, for the time of Galileo?
yes, and I'm into that rift. In the sense that I believe each one has to develop, and then if there's some commonalities, as you can't hold back, the church or the shul cannot hold back scientific research. And there's kind of, what is the Cold War? There's, they each drew their line in the sand, and I'm like, whatever. Each one has to do their thing, and ultimately there'll be some higher level of understanding these kind of parallel realities. But first you study the science. First you study the Kabbalah. We're not that advanced here in this lecture to really get how it's all one. I believe that is a valid way of doing things eventually, because actually the Kabbalah is probably the one area that can reconcile a lot of the issues that religion has with science. Judaism, particularly, I'm not talking about all the world's religions, I'm talking about whether it's the age of the universe or things like evolution. I think from a Kabbalistic perspective, there's a lot more maneuvering that can be done to kind of reconcile those worlds. But that's not, we have to get Danny to do his talk on that. But that's not the subject. That's not what I want to focus on. What I want to honestly focus on, just because and I'm going to save questions till later, is I really want to focus on what relevance does all this have to me, to you? Like, what does it make a difference? And that's what I think the goal of Hasidism, and particularly, I'm very in tune with Breslov, because it really speaks to me. I think that in the context of the Hasidic, and in particular the Breslov model, what they do is they take these teachings and they psychologize them to really explain how this is part and parcel of the human experience, or the divine potential within us. In particular, there's a teaching of the Alter Rabbi of Chabad in which he says that Kabbalah is making God into a human. Because we're talking about the divine in all these human terms. He contracted, he withdrew. It's like, you talk about, oh, what happened to that relationship? Oh, the guy withdrew, He contracted, he no longer was present. Okay. Oh, but then he extended himself, but just a little bit of himself, right? So it's like we're making God into human. Or we're talking about Adam Kadmon. There's going to be a whole discussion later in this same text about the ears of Adam Kadmon, the nose of Adam Kadmon, the mouth of Adam Kadmon, the mustache in the Idra Zuta. There's a whole discussion about God's beard and God's mustache and God's of Adam Kadmon. So it's like they're making God into a human, in the sense that we're describing God with attributes. Of course, we know they're metaphoric and so on and so forth, but we're still using these descriptions to describe the divine or levels of divinity. In Hasidism, we make the human into God. In other words, all of these things that we talk about in the divine realm, in the spherotic or olamot, the spiritual worlds, we bring it right back down into people. We find this idea kind of first spelled out very clearly by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero in Pardes Rimonim, where he says the reason why we're studying Kabbalah is that it ultimately, since all the levels of the neshama, the various levels of soul and the various spherotic levels are ultimately embodied within us, we need to understand our antecedents to be able to connect to them. It's also very much a part of the Zohar. Danny will be talking about the Shechina, the Yichud Kutshabichud Shechinte, the unification which became a Kabbalistic consciousness builder of what we are doing when we perform a mitzvah, a good deed, is unifying the transcendent and the immanent. The Zera Anpin and the Malchus, various names for kind of one bigger level of God with a more kind of intimate, the God of your understanding, whatever words you want to use. So there's already this idea in the Zohar, and throughout the Kabbalah, it's about bringing heaven to earth, bringing earth up to this concept of this unification of bringing the worlds together, the higher worlds, the lower worlds. But it becomes redone in the thought of the Hasidic masters. So let's go a little further, and then I'm going to go back, do a couple of the notes, and I'm going to reread this according to Rabbi Nachman. The way I'm going to reread it is quite simply, I'm going to reread it in ourself, how the Zimzum happens within ourself. Because there's a counterpart of the Zimzum, is we all start with infinite light, and then we have to, in order to experience the kind of individuality that we all are, the me and the you, and the separateness that we're primarily in touch with, there has to be a contraction of the infiniteness in order for us to become embodied in our own individual selves. So this becomes relevant in terms of both kind of how do I get back to that original state on some level? How do I reconnect to the kav, to the ray of light? And it could be done in a variety of ways. So let's go a little bit further in this text itself.